In the heart of Paris, 1793, a brilliant medical student vanished from the Anatomical Theater, where he spent every night among marble tables and lifeless bodies. Weeks later, the faculty returned to find the tables filled, not with decay, but with bodies preserved so perfectly they seemed to breathe, and at the center, a figure identical to the missing student, calm, serene, and impossibly alive. The final table stood empty, polished like glass, with faint, ghostly impressions along its edges, as if invisible hands had pressed against it. Something in that theater had claimed him, and now it waits for the next curious mind brave, or foolish, enough to linger too long. The stone corridors of the Parisian Anatomical Theater in the year 1793 seemed to breathe with their own cold rhythm, as if the entire building possessed lungs hidden somewhere beneath its foundations. Lanterns suspended from iron brackets quivered with faint, directionless tremors, their light forming restless silhouettes on walls stained by countless lessons in mortality. Even the benches, worn smooth by generations of scholars, appeared to sag under an invisible weight, as though they bore memories heavy enough to distort the wood itself. Anyone entering after nightfall sensed immediately that the air grew denser the farther one walked, charged with a watchfulness that no living sentinel could claim. Some nights, the theater exhaled a chill so abrupt that students swore it crawled beneath their clothes and settled along their vertebrae. Those who lingered past midnight described a quiet too deliberate to be simple absence of sound, a quiet that behaved like an entity, choosing its moments with unsettling precision. The sheets covering the bodies draped over the marble slabs occasionally rustled despite the stillness of the room, making the faintest sighing noises that suggested discomfort rather than decay. It became impossible, once the idea had been spoken aloud, not to imagine a subtle tightening of fingers or a slight shift in the angle of a jaw beneath the linen. The marble tables themselves seemed complicit in these peculiarities. Their surfaces, polished to a near liquid sheen, reflected not merely the shapes of lanterns, but sometimes flashes of movement where none should exist. Students exiting the theater late in the evening often quickened their steps without meaning to, certain that the faint echo behind them was half a beat too slow to be their own and half a beat too deliberate to be chance. One particularly anxious apprentice insisted he once felt a breath against his cheek while leaning over a cadaver, though the windows had been closed and the room otherwise motionless. His account joined the swelling collection of whispered horrors that circulated like contraband through the faculty. Each day, these sensations vanished beneath the clinical normalcy of lessons, leaving the morning air hollow and drained, as if whatever force animated the theater withdrew with the rising sun. Yet the dread that pulled behind the ribs of every observer never fully dissipated. It clung to those who entered, weaving itself into their thoughts with insidious persistence. A sense of expectancy permeated each corner, hinting that the theater waited for something, perhaps someone, to breach a threshold not yet crossed. And although those who felt this presence avoided speaking of it openly, a shared certainty grew among them, silent and unshakable. Long after the living departed, something within the Anatomical Theater continued to remain awake, watching with patient, meticulous interest, reluctant to surrender its authority over the dead. Rumors spread through the city with the speed and precision of an infection engineered by an unseen hand, carrying with them a feverish unease that settled in the marrow of those who listened. The disappearance of the most gifted student of the medical faculty would, under ordinary circumstances, have inspired concern, not panic. Yet nothing felt ordinary in Paris during the year 1793, and nothing felt predictable within the walls of the Anatomical Theater. His absence from the morning lectures was initially dismissed as weariness or a poorly timed illness, but by the hour when the bells marked the rise of the sun to its zenith, an undeniable tension had begun to coil in the corridors of the college. Those who had worked beside him sensed instantly that he had not simply stepped away. Something had intervened. The missing student's reputation had been built on a foundation of relentless curiosity so intense it often bordered on obsession. He stayed long after his peers had retreated to warmer quarters, preferring the company of cold stone and silent bodies to the revelry of taverns or the comfort of conversation. His lantern could be seen burning through the high windows of the theater until well past midnight, casting small, trembling halos that glowed like a second moon above the courtyard. Even the faculty, hardened by countless dissections and decades spent instructing the young in the discipline of rational thought, regarded him with a cautious respect. They admired his precision, his discipline, and the uncanny steadiness of his hands, yet they also recognized the peril of a mind unafraid to wander beyond the boundaries others instinctively observed. Whispers soon emerged that he had been conducting private experiments after hours, lingering among the bodies as though listening to secrets only the dead were willing to tell. Some claimed he had studied ancient texts forbidden by the church, manuscripts describing processes that halted the dissolution of flesh. Others recounted overhearing him mutter to himself about the elasticity of life, about the possibility that death might not represent an ending but a pause. The rumors varied in detail, yet aligned in tone, each insisting that the missing student had crossed a threshold not meant for a living man. Whether he had done so out of hubris or fascination remained a matter of personal speculation, but no one doubted he had gone too far. The faculty attempted to restore order by proposing rational explanations. They insisted that the turmoil gripping Paris had simply unsettled him, or that he had returned secretly to his family in the countryside. Yet each suggestion rang hollow. The city, taught with revolutionary fervor and tremors of violence, breathed suspicion into every silence and sharpened every shadow. Its citizens had grown accustomed to losing neighbors overnight, but the vanishing of a brilliant young scholar carried a different weight. People gathered in cafes, on bridges, and beneath the arches of market stalls to share their fragmented theories. They spoke in the hushed tones normally reserved for omens, not gossip. Something about the story clung to the imagination like a stain that could not be washed out. In the days that followed, the atmosphere within the Anatomical theater grew increasingly oppressive, as though the very architecture reacted to the loss. Instruments that should have remained neatly arranged on their trays were discovered in disordered, yet strangely deliberate configurations. Scalpel blades rested at exact angles, forming patterns no one could rationally explain, while cloths draped over the tables seemed to shift positions between one moment and the next. Assistants arriving at dawn found traces of recent use despite having locked the room thoroughly the previous night. Nothing was missing, yet nothing felt undisturbed. Among the students, fear began to settle into a steady, corrosive presence. Their once eager steps grew hesitant, their glances sharpened into quick, nervous scans of corners and doorways. No one wanted to admit that the theater felt different, almost expectant. The absence of the missing student left a void that behaved less like an empty space and more like a presence in its own right. It lingered behind the ears, in the pit of the stomach, in the instinctive tightening of the throat when the lantern light shifted too quickly. No one wished to acknowledge it aloud, but all felt it. The theater seemed to be waiting. The city, too, reacted with a peculiar kind of vigilance. As news of the disappearance traveled beyond the academic quarter, it acquired details that no witness had ever supplied, details woven by fear, not fact. Some swore they had seen a lone figure wandering the narrow streets near the Seine on the night he vanished, its posture rigid and strangely purposeful. Others insisted they had heard footsteps echoing behind them, matching their pace with unsettling precision, only to turn and find empty air. A group of washerwomen claimed a shadow had followed them across the embankment, stretching longer than any natural light source could justify. Paris, already brittle from revolutionary tension, absorbed these murmurs into its bloodstream, transmuting confusion into dread. Yet beneath the layers of speculation, a quieter truth lay buried, a truth sensed rather than spoken. Many believed, though none dared articulate the thought openly, that the missing student had not been taken by political turmoil or personal despair. Instead, they feared he had been claimed by the very place he had devoted his life to studying. The Anatomical theater, with its cold marble and patient stillness, had always seemed more alive than it should have been. Its long corridors absorbed footsteps too eagerly, and its echoes persisted too long. Some claim the bodies preserved there retained a presence that did not fully depart, lingering at the edge of perception like a breath felt but not heard. And the missing student, drawn to secrets others carefully ignored, might have crossed too near to whatever boundary the theater had spent decades strengthening. The more superstitious citizens began avoiding the district entirely after sunset, whispering that the theater had grown hungry. They spoke of knowledge that demanded payment, of ambition that exacted its own toll. They recalled tales from decades past of scholars losing themselves in the pursuit of understanding, swallowed not by madness but by the very structures they studied. Such stories, often dismissed as folklore, now resurfaced with newfound urgency. Paris had grown volatile enough that people no longer required proof to believe the worst. Fear alone was sufficient. Even those who prided themselves on rationality could not escape the sense that something had shifted irreversibly. The disappearance reverberated through every classroom and corridor, a silent reminder that the pursuit of truth, particularly in times of upheaval, was never without risk. The missing student had sought to understand the threshold between life and death, to map territory others preferred not to acknowledge. Whether he had succeeded or failed no longer mattered. His absence had become a presence, shaping the thoughts and movements of all who knew him. By the end of the first week, the city accepted the unsettling notion that the brilliant mind once destined to revolutionize medicine had not simply vanished. He had been absorbed, transformed, or claimed by something deeper than any earthly explanation could articulate. The whispers continued to multiply, weaving into a tapestry of fear that stretched across Paris. And though no one could say precisely what had happened, a shared belief thrummed beneath the surface. Devotion to knowledge, when pursued without restraint, had become a snare. Whatever the missing student had found within the anatomical theater had neither welcomed him nor released him, and now the city waited in uneasy silence, wondering whether the loss marked an end, or the first sign of something still gathering shape in the dark. In the days that followed the disappearance, the anatomical theater adopted a temperament that seemed almost willful, as though the building itself had absorbed the unease of its occupants and reshaped it into something tangible. Assistants entering at dawn discovered instruments arranged in configurations too deliberate to be accidents, yet too cryptic to resemble any known preparation for study. Scalpels lay parallel at exact distances, forming patterns that suggested geometry rather than medicine. Forceps balanced on their tips in impossible stillness. Bone saws rested against the marble tables at angles that aligned perfectly with the direction of the first light filtering through the high windows. These arrangements conveyed an intelligence that no trembling apprentice could have reproduced, an intention foreign to the routines of human hands. Sheets that should have remained untouched were found folded with unnerving precision, their corners aligned as though pressed by a machine rather than gathered hastily in the gloom. Some were bent into shapes faintly resembling anatomical diagrams, as if someone, or something, had attempted to imitate the visual language of the faculty. Dust on the stone floor bore impressions that hinted at movement without suggesting weight, faint disturbances that broke the surface like fabric lifted briefly and set down again. No footprints marked the path, only soft disruptions that resembled fingers or the curved edges of instruments sliding silently across the ground. The physicians attempted to restore composure through explanations that sounded increasingly rehearsed. They spoke of exhaustion, of the strain exerted by the political upheaval gripping Paris, of the human mind's tendency to impose order on chaos. Yet these rationalizations dissolved the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. None of the faculty remained in the theater after dusk. They locked doors with unnecessary force, extinguished lanterns with hasty hands, and avoided meeting one another asides. The building seemed to swallow their footsteps as they departed, leaving behind a silence that grew heavier with each passing night. The absence of the gifted student weighed on the theater with the density of mourning, though no funeral had been held and no official declaration made. His presence lingered in the small details he had once controlled, the meticulous arrangement of notes on a lectern, the faint odor of chemical preservatives near the tables he favored, the impression of restless brilliance that had animated the early hours of countless mornings. Now those same details curdled into reminders of a mind that had ventured too close to the boundary, separating inquiry from obsession. His disappearance had become a warning, one the theater seemed eager to emphasize with each inexplicable shift of its contents. Within the student body, speculation turned inward, twisting into guilt and fear. Those who had envied his talent wondered whether they had overlooked signs of impending ruin, whether a whispered remark or cautious intervention might have altered the course of his fate. Others, more fearful by nature, became convinced that he had not left the theater at all, that his curiosity had tethered him to the place in some form unrecognizable to the living. They avoided the marble tables as though they might feel a familiar hand closing around their wrists if they leaned too close. Even the most rational among them found themselves pausing at thresholds, listening for sounds that should not exist, a faint scrape of metal, a breath drawn too slowly, the suggestion of fabric brushing stone. As the day stretched into a rhythm of unease, the theater's atmosphere grew increasingly difficult to dismiss. Lamps flickered in perfect synchronization along the corridor, extinguishing one by one as though responding to a sequence of unseen movements. Glass jars containing preserved specimens clouded over despite the immaculate care of the assistants, their surfaces fogging from within. Books on anatomical theory fell open to pages discussing the boundary between life and death, the fragility of tissue, the precise moment at which warmth departs the body. It was as though the building curated its own lessons, offering them to whoever dared remain within its walls long enough to notice. The faculty tried to suppress the growing sense that the theater had become a participant rather than a passive setting. During the daylight hours, they insisted on normal routines. Lectures continued, though voices often faltered at the mention of procedures the missing student had excelled at. Demonstrations proceeded with mechanical detachment, as if every movement had to be fought for against some invisible resistance. Assistants hurried through their tasks, refusing to look at the narrow windows that seemed to watch them in return. The building breathed in the daylight, shallowly, reluctantly, until evening arrived and the true silence descended once again. Beyond the theater's walls, Paris continued its unpredictable metamorphosis. Revolutionary fervor churned through the streets, reshaping the city with a violence both ideological and physical. Yet even in that climate of unrest, the whispers surrounding the anatomical theater achieved a distinct and disquieting credibility. Word of the strange happenings escaped the confines of the faculty and seeped into nearby districts, carried by merchants, washerwomen, and laborers who claimed to hear faint clatters at odd hours or see shadows move behind glass at moments when no lantern burned inside. The disappearance of the student became a point of fearful fascination, an emblem of the dangers lurking beneath the surface of intellectual ambition. Inside the faculty, denial eroded under the pressure of accumulating evidence. A surgeon who prided himself on skepticism reported seeing an outline on a marble table that resembled the curve of a shoulder where no body lay. An instructor in physiology discovered notes written in a hand startlingly similar to that of the missing student, pinned in a margin that should have been blank. An assistant fainted upon entering the dissection hall alone, claiming that every instrument on the central table had turned to face him, their reflective surfaces angled like attentive eyes. Still, no one dared to voice the conclusion forming quietly in their minds. To acknowledge what the theater implied would be to admit that the pursuit of knowledge could awaken forces neither divine nor natural, forces that observed the living with detached curiosity. The theater had always been a place for studying the silent, the still, the inert. Now it seemed the dead, or something adjacent to them, had begun to respond. The disappearance no longer felt like an isolated tragedy, but a symptom of a deeper transformation occurring within the theater's walls. The building had become a threshold, a place where curiosity pressed too hard against the fabric separating the known from the unnameable. And though no one would speak the thought aloud, all sensed the same uneasy truth. The theater had not merely lost a promising student. It had gained something in his place, something that watched their every movement with patient, unblinking interest, waiting for the next mind bold, or foolish, enough to step too close to the edge. The morning the parcel arrived, the air over the Seine carried a raw bite, as though the city itself anticipated an intrusion it could not name. Porters hauled crates of dried herbs, medical texts, and fragile glassware to the faculty as they always did, yet among these mundane deliveries lay the coarse-wrapped object that would fracture the remaining sense of order within the anatomical theater. No one claimed responsibility for receiving it, and the porter who dropped it at the main desk insisted it had already been sitting among the day's shipments when he entered the courtyard at dawn. The linen binding it was rough to the touch, heavy with stale dampness, and held together with a knot more suited to binding bandages on a field surgeon-esque cart than wrapping scholarly correspondence. When the dean unfastened the cloth, the room's collective breath slackened at once. The drawing inside had been executed with extraordinary discipline, but something beneath that discipline undermined the security of everyone who beheld it. The page displayed a human figure stretched in a pose that refused classification, neither supine nor upright, neither in repose nor in rigor. The limbs hung at angles that suggested voluntary suspension, yet the torso bore the languor of deep unconsciousness. The shading captured the pallid tension of tissue that had not fully accepted its own demise. It was not a corpse, nor was it properly alive. It occupied a state that resisted taxonomy with a quiet, patient hostility. Even those trained to appraise cadaveric detail, without flinching, felt their pulses constrict. The labels written around the figure did not correspond to any established Latin anatomy. Instead, they resembled intimate observations, each phrased as though the one who drew the figure had not merely studied its structure, but inhabited it. The terms evoked not only sinews and membranes, but sensations, fragments of pain, glimmers of hunger, impressions of watchfulness. A line tracing the ribcage bore a phrase describing unbearable fullness, as though the chest protected something eager to consume its way out. Another note along the inner forearm referenced a longing to extend further than the joint allowed. The musculature had been annotated with descriptors too personal, too confessional, to belong to an impartial academic exercise. The handwriting was unmistakably that of the missing student. Former classmates recognized the decisive slant of his script, the way he sharpened the downstrokes when concentrating, the subtle compression of letters when his thoughts outpaced his hand. The faculty exchanged muted glances, unwilling to voice the conclusions forming in the charged stillness. Some speculated that the drawing represented a breakdown, a collapse of the student's mind under relentless pressure. Others feared that he had uncovered a principle that disturbed him so profoundly he could not articulate it plainly. A few privately wondered whether he had attempted an experiment too audacious to be sanctioned, and that the consequences of such an attempt had altered him in ways he could neither correct nor conceal. None of them spoke these suspicions aloud, yet each recognized the same silent threat. The drawing did not merely record an observation. It documented an experience. The dean studied the lower edge of the sheet and froze. The final line had been written with the same hand, but lacked the usual precision. The letters appeared smudged, as though the writer's grip had faltered. It stated that knowledge could reshape flesh, and that the barrier separating the one who studies from the one who is studied was thin enough to be breached with the correct technique. The assertion struck the assembly with the force of a physical blow. The faculty had long believed that mastery over the body required distance, emotional, intellectual, and moral. Yet here was evidence that a student they had praised for discipline and promise had abandoned that distance entirely, entering a territory where the observer risked becoming indistinguishable from the subject. The dean insisted on locking the drawing away, though his movements betrayed a slight tremor. He declared that the matter required sober evaluation and that until further notice the theater would remain under stricter control. This proclamation carried little weight. The authority of the faculty had already been eroded by weeks of unspoken dread, and the arrival of the anonymous parcel rendered their reassurances hollow. The assistants, who had once navigated the theater with brisk efficiency, now moved through the corridors as though each step might awaken something dormant beneath the flagstones. Their nightly departures grew earlier, their daytime tasks performed with forced calm that cracked under the slightest provocation. The building itself reacted to the parcel's arrival in subtle ways. Drafts traced the stairwells without identifiable origin, and the high windows collected condensation even when the air outside remained dry. The marble tables, usually indifferent to temperature, felt faintly warm to the touch, as if retaining body heat from a presence no one could identify. Students who had previously dismissed the whispered rumors now found themselves studying the corners of the preparation rooms with wary attention, half expecting to see the missing student's outline reflected in the steel of the surgical trays. The absence of direct evidence did nothing to quiet their unease. If anything, the lack of clarity made the threat more insidious. News of the drawing spread beyond the faculty, infiltrating the cafes and wine shops where the city's intellectuals sought relief from political turmoil. Some dismissed the story as hysteria fueled by the unstable climate of the revolution. Others accepted it with unnerving readiness, suggesting that in an era when citizens disappeared into prisons for crimes of suspicion, it was only natural for the dead to claim their own share of the living. A few claimed that the student had succeeded in discovering something forbidden, perhaps a technique that allowed a mind to outlive its host. No two rumors agreed, yet all fed into the same growing conviction that the anatomical theater harbored a secret powerful enough to threaten those who pursued it. Night fell with the oppressive weight of a sealed chamber. The lanterns flickered erratically, their flames wavering as if disturbed by changes in air pressure rather than by drafts. The copyist assigned to inventory the theater's research materials swore he heard faint scratching behind a locked cabinet, rhythmic yet uneven, like a hand attempting to imitate writing despite unfamiliarity with the act. He abandoned his task and refused to return, citing a sudden illness. The faculty dismissed him, though several privately wondered whether they should heed his account more seriously. The drawing's presence gnawed through the institution's remaining confidence. Its arrival could not be dismissed as an elaborate prank. It displayed too much anatomical precision, too much insight into the manner in which bodies surrender to time, manipulation, and intent. What unnerved the faculty most was not the image itself, but the implications behind it. The student had worked tirelessly, but he had never exhibited signs of instability. If he had chosen to depict a figure suspended between vitality and decay, it meant he had encountered, or endured, something that defied the limits of anatomical scholarship. The smudged final line suggested urgency, perhaps even regret, yet the message remained resolute. Knowledge could alter tissue, and the boundary between the seeker and the specimen had proved permeable. By the week's end, the faculty convened in private to determine their course of action. They spoke of securing the theater, of restricting access to cadavers, of alerting the authorities without drawing public attention. Yet beneath their deliberations lurked a fear none wished to articulate, that the student had not sent the drawing as a warning, but as a declaration. That he had crossed the threshold he described, and that something on the other side had sent the parcel in his stead. When dawn finally broke after a night so hushed it seemed to press its weight against the very stones of the anatomical theater, the faculty approached the building with the uneasy determination of men compelled not by courage but by necessity. The silence that had enveloped the structure since twilight had grown so absolute, so unyielding, that even the most skeptical among them sensed that something inside had shifted beyond the threshold of the comprehensible. No footsteps had echoed within, no lamps flickered against the tall windows, no restless assistants hurried along the corridors. It was as though the theater had exhaled once and then refused to breathe again. The doors resisted when the surgeons forced them open, their hinges groaning as if awakened from a long and reluctant slumber. The air inside possessed a stillness so complete that it felt curated, shaped into a deliberate pause. Dust motes hovered mid-air without drifting, suspended in the thin rays of early light that slipped cautiously through the high panes. The group hesitated on the threshold, for even before their eyes adjusted, they sensed that the arrangement of the room had altered, subtly, profoundly, with the precision of an unseen hand. When vision finally clarified, several among them recoiled, as if from a physical blow. For upon the central marble tables lay forms arranged with such ceremonial symmetry that the scene resembled not a laboratory, but a sanctuary, one consecrated to a logic beyond mortal doctrine. Bodies, not fresh, not decayed, but preserved with a mastery no living surgeon could claim, rested in positions suggesting both repose and expectancy. Their hands were laid flat upon their torsos, palms inward, as if guarding some secret within. Their faces, though pale and cold, bore expressions devoid of suffering, unified by an eerie calm that felt almost reverential. The faculty moved forward in halting steps. No one dared raise their voice above a whisper, and even those whispers faltered under the weight of the room's unnatural order. Lamps that should have darkened overnight now glowed faintly, though no flame flickered within them. Instruments, scalpels, retractors, bone chisels, lay arranged in perfect spirals beside the tables, echoing patterns observed in the geometry of shells or the converging arms of a galaxy. It was an arrangement too purposeful for chance, too esoteric for any standard ritual of preservation. Yet it was the new form among the preserved that drew every gaze, that silenced every half-formed explanation. Upon the central table, positioned where an instructor might once have placed a specimen for study, rested a figure identical in stature and bearing to the vanished student whose absence had haunted the theater for so many weeks. The likeness was unmistakable, the same slope of shoulder, the same lean proportions shaped by years spent bent over lectures and instruments. But the face, oh, the face, was transformed into something otherworldly in its serenity. The brows were smooth, the lips gently curved as though touched by a final, private revelation. Not a trace of agony lingered. No stiffness marred the limbs. The skin held a pallor neither living nor lifeless, a hue that defied language. One of the surgeons, a man who prided himself on a steadfast commitment to rational thought, leaned in to examine the figure more closely. His hands trembled despite his efforts to still them. He noted first the absence of decay, no odor of chemical preservative, no cracking of the skin, no stiffness in the joints. Instead, the body held a subtle tension, a readiness incongruous with its unmoving state. The fingers curled with the faintest implication of latent motion, as though frozen not in death, but in anticipation. The chest did not rise, and yet the sheet resting upon it seemed ever so slightly displaced, as if shaped by the memory of breath. Another physician attempted to trace the marks of preservation. What he discovered unsettled him more deeply than any grotesquerie he had witnessed in the theater. The incisions, barely visible, executed with a fineness surpassing any human technique, followed anatomical lines with mathematical precision. They resembled neither dissection nor standard embalming practices. They appeared instead like corrections made to a flawed drawing, adjustments guided by an intelligence that understood the human body not as a vessel to be examined, but as a form to be perfected. Tissue had been rearranged without disturbing its integrity. Musculature had been reinforced, as though sculpted into its most idealized configuration. The body was not merely preserved, it was improved. The faculty stepped back in quiet horror, their minds grappling with the implications. Some searched desperately for natural explanations, an unknown practitioner, a forbidden experiment, a deception executed with unparalleled skill. Yet each possibility dissolved upon inspection, leaving only the growing certainty that the theater had become host to a process outside the boundaries of their understanding. No one dared touch the figure after the first examinations. The limbs were too lifelike, the stillness too intentional. One assistant insisted he saw the eyelids tremble, though no others confirmed it. Another claimed that when he turned away for a moment, the fingers had shifted by the width of a hair. The faculty dismissed these statements aloud, but their pale faces betrayed how eagerly they avoided the central table as they moved through the room. The other preserved forms offered no comfort. Each bore the same meticulous craftsmanship, if craftsmanship it could be called, the same absence of decay, the same faint impression of potential motion beneath their skins. Yet none possessed the strange, luminous peace so present in the student's likeness. Those bodies seemed untouched by spirit, suspended in a limbo that neither honored nor desecrated them. But the student's body suggested purpose, completion, fulfillment of an unseen design. As the surgeons debated in strained whispers, their voices began to quaver under the strain of the unspoken truth pressing upon them. Had the student somehow achieved the impossible? Had he discovered a method to defy the decay of flesh, to reshape the body according to principles beyond the reach of contemporary science? Or worse still, had some force within the theater claimed him, using his brilliance as raw material for an experiment of its own? The room's silence seemed to deepen with each unanswered question. Shadows stretched along the floor despite the early morning light, coiling around the tables as though listening. The polished surfaces of the instruments caught glimmers of illumination that flickered without a source. A faint tremor passed through the air, not strong enough to be felt on the skin, but perceptible in the way the dust shivered above the marble. One of the senior physicians, pale to the lips, stepped back from the central table and pressed a hand against the nearest pillar as though to steady himself. He whispered that what lay before them was neither miracle nor monstrosity, but something inhabiting the space between, conceived according to laws that no human hand had ever recorded. His voice trembled as he admitted that he could no longer distinguish where the student ended and the theater began. As the others absorbed his words, a soft sound threaded through the hall, a faint, rhythmic hum, too distant to identify and too deliberate to dismiss. It emanated from no single point but from the stones themselves, as though the theater were murmuring in a tongue too old and too gentle to frighten, yet too alien to understand. The hum persisted only a moment, a breath of resonance, but it left an imprint on the minds of all present. No one approached the tables again. They withdrew slowly, as though departing a chamber of worship rather than a place of study. The doors were pulled shut with reverent caution, though all knew that wooden barriers offered no defense against forces capable of reorganizing flesh and thought alike. Outside, the morning light felt thin and insubstantial, as if touched by the same quiet alteration that had taken root within the theater. The faculty dispersed into the restless streets of Paris, each man grappling with the knowledge that the world they inhabited had shifted, imperceptibly, irrevocably, toward a future in which the familiar borders between life, death, and knowledge had begun to dissolve. In the thinning darkness before dawn, when the lamps guttered with that peculiar reluctance known only to the theater, the assistants finally noticed the single marble table that remained untouched amid the arranged forms. It stood near the back wall, where shadows assembled like silent jurors, and the stone always felt colder than the rest of the hall. The surface gleamed with such polished clarity that it reflected the faint lantern light in a wavering ribbon, as though a thin layer of water had been poured across it. No cloth covered it, no instrument lay upon it, and yet it radiated the sense of recent use, of something having departed only moments before the door hinges groaned under the weight of intrusion. The absence of any residue, not even the stray marks left by hurried students or the traces of chalk from aborted lessons, forced an unwelcome thought into every mind. Emptiness could bear witness just as surely as presence. As the sun climbed weakly behind the clouded Parisian skyline, the stone's immaculate surface revealed irregularities so slight they escaped initial notice. On closer inspection, faint impressions along the edges came into view, shallow distortions in the sheen, as if pressure had been applied from somewhere above by hands that bore neither warmth nor substance. The marks did not resemble fingerprints or the familiar soft indentations left by human flesh. Instead, they suggested form without weight, shape without mass, intention without body. The faculty stared at the subtle depressions with the same dread that accompanies an unspoken accusation. Some murmured that drafts could cause unpredictable patterns in the polish, but their own voices faltered at the feebleness of such explanations. The theater's draftlessness had been a point of pride since its construction in the year 1787, and no shifting breeze had ever before carved symmetrical intervals into marble. The discovery rekindled every rumor that had seeped through the city's arteries since the disappearance of the gifted student. Citizens in cramped cafes whispered about an unseen figure haunting the corridors at night, its steps unheard but its absence unmistakable. They spoke of quills left standing in inkpots without human touch, of anatomical sketches rearranged into sequences too deliberate to be random. Within the faculty, theories divided into two uneasy camps. One insisted that the missing student had been claimed by the very bodies he had studied with such fervor, absorbed into a silent fellowship bound by laws older than anatomy. The other group believed he had transcended some threshold through the method hinted at in his last, trembling letter, attaining a state that hovered between animation and demise. This possibility, while monstrous, offered an explanation that at least adhered to the realm of ambition. The notion that he might still walk, unseen, through the theater's hush, unsettled the mind but satisfied the logic of transformation. Ruminations spread like mildew through the building's bones. Assistants avoided the lonely table even during daylight, stepping around it with the cautious reverence reserved for burial grounds. When they swept the floors, they circled it widely. When they carried instruments across the hall, they angled their paths so that nothing cast a shadow over its gleaming surface. The faculty refused to assign it to practical lessons, claiming preservation of tradition, though privately each instructor admitted an instinctive revulsion, as if laying a body there would constitute an invitation rather than an instruction. The memory of the preserved forms discovered 2 nights prior lingered behind every thought, especially the calm expression on the newest edition, whose resemblance to the vanished student felt more symbolic than physical, a likeness sculpted out of something that imitated serenity rather than experienced it. In the weeks following, the theater acquired a sound that had not existed before, a faint, rhythmic pulse, barely audible, more sensed than heard. It resembled neither footsteps nor breath, but had the unsettling quality of something practicing the idea of life without fully rising into it. The pulse seemed to emanate from within the marble slabs themselves, spreading through the stone like a whisper rehearsing its own courage. Students reported that when they entered at dawn, a tremor passed through the tables, subtle as a shiver running along a spine. They described it with the uneasy certainty of those who do not trust their senses yet cannot deny them. The faculty dismissed such claims as exhaustion, though no instructor remained in the theater past sunset to personally refute them. As spring approached, a pattern emerged. Whenever new cadavers were delivered under the veil of night, 1 or 2 would be found repositioned by morning with their limbs arranged in postures echoing the anonymous illustration sent in the earlier parcel. The artistry grew more pronounced with each passing week, as though the unseen curator refined its technique through silent observation. No locks were broken, no hinges disturbed, and yet the arrangements continued with methodical precision. Eventually, the deliveries ceased altogether. The suppliers refused to approach the theater after a courier claimed he saw his own shadow elongate unnaturally across the courtyard, stretching along the stones toward the entrance before recoiling like a living thread. Fear, once vague and diffuse, anchored itself firmly in the city's mind. By midsummer, theories turned toward inevitability. Some insiders whispered that the student had become custodian of a hidden order, one dedicated not to the preservation of bodies, but to the reconfiguration of the boundary that separated the anatomist from the anatomical. These voices insisted that the empty table belonged to him alone, a locus of transition rather than rest, a stage upon which the next revelation would be enacted. Others clung to the idea that he walked among them in an undefined interval between existence and cessation, studying the living as dispassionately as he once studied the dead. This hypothesis unsettled even its proponents, for it implied that observation moved in both directions now, and that the living were no longer the only ones capable of examining the state of being. The theater continued its work, but reluctance permeated every gesture. Students hurried through dissections, avoiding the corners where shadows pooled and ignoring the faint gleam of the empty table. No one dismissed the sense of anticipation that hovered like a suspended verdict. Even the city's revolutionaries, hardened by execution squares and ceaseless unrest, avoided the theater's district after sundown, citing an instinct older than courage. Something had shifted irreversibly within those walls. Whether born of ambition or awakened from the marble itself, the presence lingered with the patience of an entity unconstrained by mortality. And so the theater endured, its corridors humming with that muted pulse, its tables gleaming like altars awaiting an unnamed offering. The empty slab remained unclaimed, its mirror-like polish catching every flicker of lantern light and bending reflections into shapes that dissolved before they could be recognized. Each person who entered felt the same prickle along the spine, the same sensation of another gaze intersecting their own from a vantage point they could not locate. Whatever truth guided these impressions, one certainty grew inescapable. The stillness of the theater had become a new kind of language, one spoken by marble and shadow alike, inviting the next curious soul to listen more closely than wisdom allowed.